Welcome to the deep dive. We usually talk about the French Revolution as if it were just this singular event.
Right. Completely contained within the city limits of Paris.
Exactly. You know the standard narrative. The Bastille falls, the king loses his head, and then
Napoleon shows up to tidy the place up.
right, Napoleon shows up. But looking at the stack of research we've pulled for today, that feels like a massive oversimplification for you listening.
Oh, it absolutely is.
It looks less like a local political dispute and more like the epicenter of a global ideological earthquake.
An earthquake, yeah. But I'd actually argue it was also a contagion.
A contagion.
Yeah. When we really dig into the primary sources, we're talking letters from terrified plantation owners in the Caribbean, furious pamphlets from British intellectuals.
Mm,
We see that the French Revolution wasn't just about France at all.
right.
It was about the release of a very specific, very volatile set of ideas.
Mm.
And the fascinating thing is that when those ideas escaped Paris, they didn't just fade away, they mutated.
They mutated. And that is the action versus reaction framework we are bringing to you today. Because the shockwaves from Paris seem to have created two completely contradictory realities depending on where they actually landed.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're tracking those shockwaves.
Right.
In one direction, specifically across the Atlantic to Saint-Domingue, the revolution morphs into a radical war for racial equality that went far beyond what any French politician intended.
And in the other direction.
Right, in the other direction, specifically in England and the rest of monarchical Europe, it triggers this rigid intellectual immune response.
An immune response that effectively births modern conservatism.
Exactly.
So for you tracking this at home, we have a revolution of action in the Caribbean and a revolution of reaction in Europe. But before we get to those front lines, we have to define the payload.
The virus itself.
Yeah, the virus. What was the actual ideology that France let loose in 1789?
It really comes down to two main concepts that just shattered the operating system of the 18th century: popular sovereignty and legal equality.
Popular sovereignty being the idea that power flows upward from the people, not downward from God.
Right. And legal equality being the dismantling of aristocratic privilege.
The idea that no one is born with a legal right to rule over anyone else.
Exactly. Now, these are beautiful concepts on paper.
Sure.
The problem, and the source of all the chaos we're about to discuss, is that the French National Assembly was incredibly hypocritical about applying them.
This is the colonial question. I was actually reading through the minutes of the National Assembly from 1790, and the cognitive dissonance is just staggering.
Oh, it's wild.
You have these men standing on podiums shouting about the rights of man, but the moment someone mentions the Caribbean colonies, the room just
Go silent.
goes totally silent.
And silence was the best case scenario. Usually it was active suppression. You have to remember, France wasn't just a nation,
It was an empire.
an empire, right?
What?
And the jewel of that empire was Saint-Domingue,
Yep.
modern-day Haiti. It was the most profitable colony in the world. It was responsible for something like 40% of Europe's sugar and 60% of its coffee.
So applying liberty and equality to the colonies would have essentially bankrupted the French revolutionary state.
That is the trap.
Hmm.
They needed the cash to fund the revolution at home, but the cash was generated by the very institution.
Chattel slavery.
Exactly, chattel slavery, which their revolution claimed to abhor.
Let's zoom in on Saint-Domingue for a second, because to understand the explosion there, we really have to understand the pressure cooker. The demographics alone are terrifying.
Terrifying is the exact right word. By 1789, you have about 30,000 white colonists and roughly 500,000 enslaved Africans.
So the ratio is nearly 15 to 1.
15 to 1. But it's not just the sheer numbers, it's the nature of the labor itself. Sugar production is incredibly grueling.
And dangerous.
Very dangerous. The attrition rate was so high that plantation owners in Saint-Domingue didn't rely on natural reproduction among the enslaved population.
I actually saw a quote in the sources from a plantation manager that treated it like this grim, brutal calculus.
Oh, I know the one.
He essentially said it was cheaper to work a slave to death in 7 years
7 years, yeah.
and then just buy a replacement rather than spend money on food and medical care to keep them alive for 20.
That was the standard economic model. It was a death machine.
Yeah.
So when rumors start drifting across the Atlantic that the white people in France are killing their masters and talking about freedom,
The enslaved population in Saint-Domingue isn't just listening.
no, they're planning.
And the spark finally hits in August 1791, a massive uprising in the northern plains. But this is where the story usually gets simplified into, slaves versus masters.
Right.
The reality seems infinitely more complex. This wasn't just a mob. It became a geopolitical war involving 3 superpowers.
And this is where we have to introduce Toussaint Louverture. If you look at military history, his maneuvering during this period is almost unparalleled.
He's a fascinating figure.
He really is. He starts as a leader of the slave rebellion, but he doesn't immediately fight for the French Republic.
This is the part that actually confused me initially. He joins the Spanish army.
He does, and you really have to look at it from his perspective. The French government, even the revolutionary one, is still dithering.
Right, they haven't actually abolished slavery yet.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Spain controls the other half of the island, the modern-day Dominican Republic, and they are at war with revolutionary France.
So Spain sees an
A
opportunity.
huge opportunity to humiliate France. So they offer the rebel leaders guns, supplies, and freedom if they fight for the Spanish crown.
Let me just get this straight. Louverture is fighting against the country that literally invented the rights of man.
Yes.
Wearing a Spanish uniform.
Yes.
Because the Spanish king was the only one offering him a concrete deal for freedom.
He was a pragmatist, he was fighting for black liberty, and he used whatever tool was available. And he was winning. He and his troops were devastating the French colonial forces.
But then the tectonic plates shift again.
Right. 1794.
This is the moment the French National Assembly finally wakes up.
They had no choice, really. They were losing the colony. The Spanish were attacking from the east, and the British had also invaded.
Wait, the British too?
Oh, yeah. They wanted to snag the colony while France was weak. They were attacking from the coast. The French commissioners realized that the only way to hold on to Saint-Domingue was to get the Black Army on their side.
So in February 1794, they officially abolished slavery.
And that changes everything. Once the decree is official, Louverture pivots
He abandons the Spanish.
completely, joins the French Republicans, and turns his army against his former allies. He drives the Spanish out, and then he turns his attention to the British.
I think people forget the British involvement here, because this wasn't just a minor skirmish.
Not at all.
Britain lost more soldiers in Saint-Domingue trying to re-enslave the population than they did in the entire Peninsular War against Napoleon later on.
It was an absolute graveyard for the British Army. Louverture's forces were highly disciplined, they knew the terrain inside and out, and they were fighting for their very existence.
Right.
By 1801, Louverture is effectively the ruler of the entire island. He even issues a constitution that abolishes slavery forever.
But the story has a final, pretty tragic act. Because France changes management yet again,
Into Napoleon Bonaparte.
and he is not a fan of this Black Republic.
Napoleon wants the empire back. He considers the loss of the colony's revenue a complete disaster. So in 1802, he sends a massive expeditionary force, tens of thousands of troops.
With secret instructions.
Yes, secret instructions to essentially reset the clock, re-enslave the population, and decapitate the leadership.
They trick Louverture. They arrest him and ship him to a prison in the French Alps.
Where he dies of cold and neglect.
It's a brutal end for a man who literally saved the colony for France.
It was a profound betrayal. But Napoleon vastly underestimated the resolve of Louverture's lieutenants, specifically Jean-Jacques Dessalines. When it became clear that the French intended to bring back slavery, the war turned into a scorched earth conflict. Dessalines famously ripped the white stripe out of the French tricolor flag to create the Haitian flag.
Wow.
His slogan was, "Coup tête, boule quai," cut heads, burn houses.
And they won. In 1804, they declare independence. The second independent republic in the Americas?
And the first ever founded by formerly enslaved people.
It must have sent a shockwave of terror through every slaveholding society in the Americas.
Including the United States. It proved that the property could wake up, organize, and completely defeat a European superpower.
That is the radical realization of the French Revolution's ideals, taken far further than the French themselves ever dared.
Exactly.
So that is the action. That's the revolution breaking chains. Now, for you listening, we need to pivot 180 degrees to the reaction.
European reaction.
Right. Because while Louverture is reading the Declaration of the Rights of Man as a license for freedom, there are intellectuals in Europe reading the exact same document and seeing a suicide note for civilization.
This brings us straight to the British Parliament and to Edmund Burke.
Burke.
If Louverture is the avatar of radical liberation, Burke is the father of modern conservatism. And we need to be very specific about his critique here.
Because it's often misunderstood.
Exactly. It's often just cast as old man yells at cloud.
Which isn't fair. I've always found Burke interesting because he wasn't a reactionary in the traditional sense. He actually supported the American Revolution.
He did.
He wasn't against all change. So why did he completely lose his mind over the French Revolution?
That is the crucial distinction. He supported the American Revolution because he saw it as Englishmen fighting to restore their traditional rights.
Okay.
But he looked at France and saw something new and frankly terrifying to him: abstract rights.
Abstract rights. Unpack that for us.
Burke argued that you can't just invent rights on a piece of paper. He believed that rights are an inheritance. They're passed down through generations of tradition, custom, legal precedent.
Like a structural foundation.
Yes. He called society an organic partnership between the dead, the living, and the unborn.
I mean, it sounds poetic, but isn't it also incredibly convenient? If you say rights come from tradition, aren't you just freezing the status quo?
That is the counter-argument.
It feels like a very fancy way of telling the poor, sorry, your grandfather was poor, so you have to be poor too, because tradition.
And that is the exact valid critique of Burke. It's one that his contemporary, Thomas Paine, made repeatedly. But Burke's counter-argument to that was, if you tear down the complex web of social institutions, the church, the guild, the aristocracy, the monarchy...
Just because they don't fit your mathematical theory of equality.
Right. If you do that, you remove the only things holding human nature in check.
He actually has that famous line in his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he predicts that once the dust settles, the only thing left will be a military dictator.
And here's the crazy part. He writes this in 1790. This is years before the Reign of Terror, a full decade before Napoleon takes power. He looks at the French dismantling their institutions and basically says this will end in blood, and then it will end in tyranny.
And he was right. That's the annoying thing about Burke for his critics. He sounds like a huge pessimist, but his prediction was terrifyingly accurate.
Which is why he became so influential. When the guillotine started working overtime in 1793, Burke didn't look like a grump anymore. He looked like a prophet.
He convinced the British ruling class that the French disease had to be contained at all costs.
Yes. He provided the intellectual armor to fight against democracy for the next century.
But Burke is still, in a sense, a moderate. He wants to preserve the good parts of the past. There was a darker reaction, though.
Much darker.
A reaction that didn't just want to hit the brakes, it wanted to throw the car in reverse.
Now we're entering the territory of Joseph de Maistre. If Burke is the conservative, Maistre is the reactionary.
He was a diplomat, right?
From Savoy, yes. He had to flee the French armies, and that personal experience completely radicalized his view. He didn't want to debate rights. He wanted to crush the very idea of them.
I read some summaries of his work from our sources, and it is pretty bleak. He seems to think that the entire Enlightenment project, reason, debate, constitutions, that it's all just a sham.
Worse than a sham. He thought it was dangerous arrogance. Maistre argued that human reason is weak and self-serving.
So people shouldn't be trusted to think for themselves.
Exactly. If you let people question authority, they will never stop until they've torn everything down. Therefore, authority must be absolute. And crucially, it must be irrational.
Irrational, meaning it shouldn't make sense.
Meaning it shouldn't be subject to question. You obey the king, not because the king is smart or good or elected. You obey him because he is the king.
It's the divine right on steroids.
Exactly. Maistre believed that the only thing holding society back from total chaos was fear.
Which brings us to that disturbing focus he has on the executioner.
It is one of the most famous and unsettling passages in conservative literature. He describes the executioner as the absolute cornerstone of civilization.
That is dark.
He argues that all order ultimately rests on the person who is willing to kill to enforce it. It's a very dark, Hobbesian view of humanity.
So while Burke is arguing for the wisdom of our ancestors, Maistre is arguing for the necessity of the hangman.
Precisely. And while Maistre might sound like a supervillain to modern ears, his ideas were incredibly useful to the European monarchs after Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815.
Congress of Vienna.
Right. When they gathered at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe, they didn't use Jefferson or Voltaire as their guide. They used Maistre. They tried to build a fortress around Europe to ensure that revolution never happened again.
So we have this incredible spectrum of reaction. For you keeping track, on one end, you have Toussaint Louverture and the Haitians, proving that the revolution's ideals were powerful enough to destroy the institution of slavery. And on the exact opposite end, you have Burke and Maester, using the revolution's violence to justify a crackdown on liberty that lasted for decades.
And that is why I call it a civil war of ideas. The French Revolution didn't resolve the question of liberty. It weaponized it.
It weaponized it. I like
It
that.
gave us the modern language of human rights, but it simultaneously gave us the modern playbook for suppressing them in the name of order.
It really complicates the legacy of 1789. We like to think of history as this straight line toward progress. We get smarter, we get freer.
But history rarely works like that.
No, this suggests that every push for freedom generates an equal and opposite reaction.
And we're still living in that dynamic today. Every time there's a major social movement, you can see the ghosts of 1790. You see the Louvertures pushing for immediate justice and the overturning of systems.
And you see the Burkes.
Exactly. You see the Burkes warning that the cost of disruption is just too high, that we're moving too fast, that we're destroying the fabric of society.
It really makes you wonder about the nature of change itself. Is that tension a bug in the system, or is it the feature?
That's the big question.
Do we need the Burkes to keep the Louvertures from burning the house down? Or do the Burkes just ensure the house stays a prison?
That is the core question the French Revolution asks us. And considering we're still debating it over 200 years later, I don't think we've found the answer yet.
It also leaves you with another thought to mull over. If ideas are truly contagions, like you said at the start, can any movement ever actually control the ideology it creates? Once you open that box, it belongs to everyone.
A very unsettling thought, but very true.
Well, on that cheerful note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. It's a heavy topic, but understanding these two extremes really helps clarify a lot of the political noise we hear today.
Absolutely. It's all part of the same long conversation.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.